Today on the Dolby Institute Podcast, we're discussing the music of The Color Purple. This is the new filmed version of the famous novel by Alice Walker, this time an adaptation of the hit Broadway musical, which won 2 Tony Awards, including Best Revival of a Musical. Joining us is the Academy Award-nominated composer Kris Bowers, who wrote the score, as well as the film's director, Blitz Bazawule. This is another excellent interview conducted by our now regular guest host, music journalist Jon Burlingame. Take it away, Jon.
We're delighted to have with us both the director and the composer of The Color Purple. Blitz Bazawule is an award-winning filmmaker, musician, author, and visual artist, a Grammy nominee for his work with Beyoncé on Black is King. And Kris Bowers is the Oscar, Emmy, and Grammy-nominated composer of such films as Green Book and King Richard, and television, including Bridgerton. Welcome to you both.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jon.
Blitz, let me start by asking you, how important was it for you to take on The Color Purple?
It meant everything. I mean, first of all, The Color Purple is a deeply sacred work, deeply sacred text, starting, of course, with Alice Walker's brilliant Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Steven Spielberg's cinematic classic, and, of course, the Tony Award-winning Broadway play. So when you're called in, the bar is incredibly high. And so for me, it was most important that I knew or understood that there was something to add. And it ended up that the thing to add was an exploration of Seeley's headspace. Understanding that people who deal with trauma and abuse are often miscategorized as docile and passive and waiting to be saved, which couldn't be further from the truth. Ultimately, through this character of Seeley, we find the machinations of her working to free herself, liberate herself from her abuser. We also see her go through her journey, her healing journey, that includes forgiveness, that it includes learning how to love, who to love. So it was incredibly important that I treated this with the utmost importance and ultimately trying to find my own way into the story. As a kid that grew up in Ghana, my imagination was all I had. Wasn't much around, film school, cameras, musical equipment, musical instruments. And so through my headspace, I found escape and I found the world through that. And so, looking at Seeley, I could understand what that confinement of the physical can be and what kinds of liberation can occur when you're inside your head and have the opportunity.
So when did you bring Kris on board, and why Kris as your composer?
I brought Kris on very early. And I brought Kris on early because I really believe in my entire team being on the same page right when we begin. I don't believe in silos as a filmmaker. And ultimately, I fancy myself more of a conductor than anything else. I need my entire symphony to start building some kind of harmony. And I can't wait till the very ending to bring on my composer when so much has already been discussed and he's coming in as an add-on. And so bringing Kris on also helped Kris understand kind of how we were approaching music from a macro perspective. Like what were the intentions around these choices that then he could then expand into the scoring process. And why Kris? I mean, he's the coolest cat. That's just it. He's the coolest cat you can find and incredibly talented, but also understands this work deeply, understands the healing spirit of a project like The Color Purple. So it was very, very easy.
Yeah, and Kris, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. What are your memories of The Color Purple, either as a book or film or both?
I first read the book freshman year of high school. It was an assigned text, and once we finished the book, we then watched the film in class. And for me, it felt like, as Blitz said, it felt so obvious how important the work was just for our community and our culture. And I had an understanding through my family how important the film was. But my personal connection with it came in the form of realizing that Quincy Jones was a film composer, because I never knew of him as a film composer. I only knew of him as a record producer. And so, hearing that score, that led me down my rabbit hole of realizing that he was this prolific composer and studied with Nadia Boulanger in France, and how this man went from being a jazz trumpet player to a record producer to an incredible film composer. I think became a huge beacon for me in terms of aspiring to become a film composer myself, and seeing a black man achieve that, I think created a really big anchor for me in order to see that for myself.
And Kris, can you tell us exactly what your job was on The Color Purple? Because you're not the songwriter, you're the score composer. And I think people may not fully understand how those things all sort of come together.
The way Blitz and I talked about it in the beginning was, my job was to provide the emotional glue with the score, right? Like, there's so many times where we are coming out of a very dramatic moment into a song, or we're coming out of a song into a dramatic moment. There are also so many times where, we need to represent what's happening internally for these characters, and there's no song to tell us lyrically what's happening. And so music is, in that way, serving as a way to help us connect with the emotions of these characters. And I did do a couple of the arrangements for some of the songs as well. But like Blitz said, really my involvement with the songwriting team extended into my composition process, just by being immersed in those songs, understanding those songs and how they work, and understanding the best way to write my themes in a way that would have some sort of tangential relationship to the songs themselves. And so, anytime you're watching the movie and you hear music that's not accompanied by lyrics, most likely that's music that I've composed.
And Blitz, what kind of discussions did you have with Kris at the outset about what you felt the score needed to accomplish?
It was very, very clear that we had inherited a large amount of music that spanned an incredibly large amount of African American musical genius, starting, of course, with the spirituals that become gospel, the gospel that becomes blues, blues that becomes jazz, and then it births all of popular music after that. And so the biggest, most important thing was, first of all, figuring how we were going to create the glue to connect all of these often separated musical genres. And I knew that, I knew very early that Kris understood very intrinsically how the things that linger sonically between these worlds, how gospel doesn't just become blues. There are elements that kind of still linger from gospel to blues, and between blues and jazz, there are elements that linger as well. And so I knew that he'll very easily be able to make those connections. I also knew that we'll have to figure out a level of proximity to audiences today. And I really value that because, we're making this film for audiences of all ages, but most in particular for a newer generation, and that matters. And so it's very important that, we figured out elements, again, that have survived from those eras into now. And one of the languages, Kris and I speak is hip hop. Hip hop culture is ultimately youth culture and connects us, even though Kris is incredibly adept at, the classical language of music, and I'm not. We could find hip hop as the bridge, and so, I could give him references like, this needs to feel more like Southern hip hop, like Goody Mob or Outkast. And he can take that and create a classical cue out of that feeling because he understands it. And if I say I need something that's like East Coast, hip hop from the 90s, like, Biggie Smalls or Nas, he can very intrinsically know exactly what I mean and turn and create a composition that is aggressive, based on those. Then we used that language to connect some of these very complex musical compositions that are like, very elevated, but their sources were very, very proximate to audiences today. So that was a very, very big thing that kind of flows all the way through the film. These two elements of creating proximity, to audiences today, but also understanding that the score will be glue.
So, Kris, how did you begin? Did you start by writing themes for characters or situations, or do you sort of conceive the sound world, what it should sound like first?
For this one, it was kind of a bit of both. Like, I wrote a couple of the arrangements for the songs first before I started writing the score. And so that started to set some ideas in my mind in terms of what the palette could be, like thinking about, especially like Blitz said, how much those cues in particular really spoke to this imagination that Seeley had. I think about What About Love, and like there's like this really lush orchestration and this like huge rich sound. And so I knew that was a pillar for the spectrum of where this score could exist, that we could, if we wanted to or needed to, go in this really lush, fully orchestrated way, because that kind of had already been established. But the other thing that actually really helped was Blitz had a sketch of the entire movie that he shared with me when we first met and had temp score in there. And what the temp score really showed me was that it was so smart because he chose pieces that had an intimacy to them. And that was really helpful to see how these intimate moments in the score would help us feel a different type of connection to these characters than these big songs would. And they also would immediately set themselves apart sonically. And it also felt like it really mirrored where Seeley was in the beginning of the film. So like the first theme that I wrote was Seeley's theme. And the first version I wrote was, the version that you hear in the first 20 minutes of the movie. There's a few instances of it. And that's just like a simple upright piano and like detuned banjo and a couple of solo string instruments. And for me, it sprang out of this idea of looking at the intimacy and wanting to have this closeness to her, also the simplicity of her life at that point, and almost like loneliness to it as well, while also still having this like bittersweet quality to it. So that was like a lot of the inspiration for that cue. But then I also wanted to go to the other side of the spectrum and start writing cues that had a huge, bigger sound to it, and looking at Seeley and Nettie's theme, that whole opening sequence, and knowing that we needed to have something that could really lift in the same way that the emotions are lifting in this story. And one of the things that Blitz talked about in our first meeting was like, this is going to be an epic journey in terms of like what we see, how we see this part of the country, how we see this part of the world, and being able to experience it on this level that really matched the emotional journey that Celie was going to go on, and this growth that she was going to have. So like, the score needed to have that scope and scale as well. So I kind of started off with those 2 points, something really, really intimate and something really, really lush, to then see how we can bridge the gap. And the other thing I'll say to that is that what's so exciting about being brought on so early is that I was able to pretty much finish a pass of the film weeks before we recorded. And so then we were able to sit back and watch the movie multiple times and say like, you know what, actually we need to go bigger here. Like actually this all these big cues don't feel big enough actually. So let's try to go there and like, you know, refine and refine and refine. So a lot of the cues that I wrote, you know, before while Blitz was still shooting lasted the entire time, but they also continued to like be tinkered with and refined as we sat with them, which is really helpful.
So Blitz, can you talk about what this, I presume, quite long collaboration was like for you? Because, of course, you brought Kris on early, but then you must have been pretty busy shooting the film for a while. Did you continue a conversation with Kris through this period?
Yes, and I did that with everyone. You know, I really, again, value the entire orchestra the same, you know, and I really believe that if we are all working simultaneously, then ideas that Kris is coming up with will affect me while I'm on the set, and ideas that we're coming up with on the set will be affecting Kris while he works. So there aren't these follow periods where you have to guess. We could always be sharing information, you know, you could always see where we were going. There was always parts of the movie were cut together before we were done. So Kris, you could come in and watch this scene, you know, cut together, and you can go, okay, I think I know where this is going, and I know I can start working. And ultimately, you know, I love this Michael Jordan quote, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing so wrong, but he goes, I never lost the game. I only run out of time. You know, and I really believe that's how, you know, that's the difference between a good movie and a bad movie. You know, you never make a bad movie. You just run out of time. So, you know, I really value time, and I really value us all starting ahead of time so that somewhere along the line, we can all go, all right, now we don't have to be in a panic mode. We've had time to live with the material. We know its effect. We know what can be better, what needs to be scaled down, because sometimes you assume this moment requires a big, lush score. Then you realize after watching it a couple times and after other scenes come in and are cut in, you realize that, okay, there's a bit of redundancy here. We're going too big too quickly. So you have to start pulling back. And so it's really about keeping time and space. And again, I really am very open to the entire group taking ownership of the film. You know, yes, I am the director, and my job is to have an opinion, and my job is to captain this ship as best I can. But I really believe that everybody that is on my ship, once aligned and working in harmony, can really advance my vision in a really tangible way. And so, you know, everybody knows they can bring an idea, and we all collectively vet ideas. I mean, my editor was showing me stuff that he thought we didn't have in the script. And so we'd have to go back and shoot them. And now I see the cut, and I can't believe it wasn't in the script to begin with. But it's all about giving everybody ownership. And the same is true with Kris. You know, the suggestions and the ideas that, you know, he came up with end up kind of helping us. And also because he was very integral to the orchestrations of the actual musical numbers, there was a fluidity and there was a shorthand with the rest of the team. He wasn't like the composer who comes in at the end that nobody knows. Everybody on the project knew Kris. And so there was a shorthand, and everybody was very, very, excited to hear each cue he'll bring, because it always just elevated wherever we were at.
Kris, you mentioned banjo a little bit earlier. There's actually a lot of banjo being played in the movie that we see. Did you write any of that, or did you have a hand in what we see Mr. playing?
Yeah, so I wrote the Mr.'s main theme with Nick Baxter, one of the music producers. The main theme that we hear at the beginning of the movie, and then there's a couple of other instances where he plays that, and that really became integral to the sound of Mr.'s theme anytime we hear it in the score, not only melodically, but there's a lot of textures. I think about the cue where he kicks Nettie out of the house. There's maybe 6 layers of banjo. Some of it's just like literally rubbing the skin on the banjo and creating this kind of like interesting texture to it. And that's been like affected. Or there's, more detuned banjo tremolo that creates this kind of uneasy feeling. And these low bass hits are actually banjo that's been detuned by a few octaves. So, that being a sound that was associated with him, it was fun to really create this more deconstructed approach to using that instrument. And I was just really inspired by the idea of making this instrument sound like something else that we don't always place, where we don't always place it. And that came also, again, from being a part of those early conversations where, Blitz talked about, that's another moment where he talked about hip hop. Like he was like, I want in the very first notes of this movie where we hear the banjo being played over the logo, for that 14-year-old kid to be sitting there being like, oh, this is kind of dope. Like, this is like, I can like rock with this essentially. And I feel like that energy was so clear to me because like there's so many, like, I know what that means. Like he can say that and I'm like, I know exactly what you mean in terms of what that needs to feel like. And to take an instrument like the banjo and try to bring it into this time and into this culture in that way, or bring it to this era of the culture, I think was so fun and again set the table for how I wanted to approach a lot of the score for sure.
And what about the geography of the places that we visit? I mean, we're in Georgia a lot of the time, but we're also in Africa. And I wonder if those scenes required a different approach.
Yeah, I think that that was another moment where Blitz's specificity is so crucial to this story. Blitz in our first meeting again was like, this is not Africa like as a blanket thing. It's a very specific tribe. We're in the Ashanti tribe in Ghana, and that's where they're pulling all of their clothing from in that whole sequence, where they're pulling as much of that tradition as possible into what we're seeing visually. And so musically, it was important for the score in that section to pull from that as well. So, being able to work with a Ghanaian percussionist that was going to play on that was so helpful to have that specificity, because I explained to him what the scene was and how the scene was about the British moving that tribe out from their land. And just to kind of give him an idea, I was just like, it's sometimes helpful for a musician to know what they're playing to. And I was so happy I did that, because he was like, well, actually, there's a traditional piece about that. And he played that piece for me, and then we talked about how we might be able to shape that piece into the piece that I was already writing. And so we found a way to use this traditional Ghanaian piece from the Ashanti tribe to score this moment about their experience, which for me, again, is like not only so special because hopefully someone who maybe has that experience or is from that culture can hear and know that we did that research to honor them. But it also just, to me, always operates on a subconscious level when there's that much intention that goes to being specific about something like that.
And I wonder if you could chime in on that whole idea, Blitz, because, of course, your own background, I think, probably had something to do with some of those choices.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean, specifically as Kris said, understanding the specificities of a tribe allows you to kind of, be authentic, right? But that also expanded. I've been living in Georgia for over 10 years. And so I also understand what, Southern life is, and so even when I got this job, I mean, you talked about geography and location. I mean, I spent a lot of time, driving the length and breadth of Georgia, looking for those locations, finding that beach, finding that town, Grantville, which became, pretty much our one-stop shop. We shot everything in that town, and the swamp where Suge Avery's barge comes up. I mean, these were all really incredible places. And I think the more specific you are, the more universal, I believe, because ultimately we're telling these human stories. And the more we can hone in on a specific place, specific time, the more the world, people who may not even be related or tangential to the culture can relate. And so specificity is very important. But also, it also was about, asking ourselves, what are some of the elements that survive today? Like, we know all of this is on a continuum. What kids create today with music and dance isn't something that just comes out of thin air. It's inherited. Sometimes it's so deep they can't even trace it. But I think that for us, it was also important that everybody knew that these reference points are going to be important in telling this story. Again, my own experience as a kid growing up in Ghana, enamored by cinema and its potential and possibilities, is kind of what I always ask myself. And I'll tell you what, the scene, for instance, of Celie and Suge Avery in the movie theater, that was not in the script when I got it. But I was asking myself, what are all the things that are all mind blowing? Well, at least to me when I was a kid, radio was mind blowing to me. I didn't know how it worked, or a record player. Like, where did the sound come from? So, when Celie winds that gramophone and her mind expands into this giant gramophone, that was me as a kid. I imagined everything, in a grand way. When I was a kid and, there weren't many cinema houses, so my family never went to the movies. That was not a thing we did. But there were evangelicals that would come and show movies in the park for free. And, you finish your chores early because you want to go sit outside and watch a movie. And they often showed, The Last Temptation of Christ, which at the time I had no idea was a Martin Scorsese movie. So I always say, yes, the evangelicals succeeded in converting me, but to cinema of all places, it really was mind blowing, watching a movie at that scale projected in open air cinema, and the wild thing was it was dubbed in our local language, so there goes, William Dafoe as Jesus Christ speaking in my local language. It was mind boggling. I didn't even know how it worked. I just knew that my mind expanded by seeing that and going, whatever that is, I want to be a part of it. I mean, down the line, of course, I find out it's a Martin Scorsese movie written by Paul Schrader. I go, my goodness, these guys did Taxi Driver. Marty did, Goodfellas. I mean, he makes gangster movies. The guy who made Jesus Christ movies makes gangster movies. It was mind blowing. But so when Celie and Suge, go into the movie theater, for me, that was a moment of my own mind being expanded by this medium. And Celie can find through that image of cinema herself and how to love and who to love, and her feelings for Suge grow. But that was me as a kid, just being so enamored by these mediums, photography, which is why when we push into Suge Avery's photograph, it comes alive. That was me as a kid, just imagining what these photos we had in our albums as a kid, what the worlds behind them were, because most of them were taken before I was born. Right. And then, like I said, the gramophone, I mean, we had a record player at home and I lived for that thing, and the same is true for cinema. So all these big moments of expansion for Celie, in a way, I mean, they say, the artist always puts a piece of themselves in the work. And that was what it was for me, asking myself, how did my mind expand as a kid and who was curious about the world, and how would it work for Celie, who is doing the same thing? Yes, she's escaping abuse and but it was all the same thing. All of it was escapism and how you build that in your head first before you can actually achieve it in real life.
So, Kris, we reached the point where you're ready to record the final score. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where you recorded and maybe any special memories, what it was like to be there and how big the orchestra was.
We recorded in LA, here in LA at Warner Brothers on the Eastwood scoring stage. And, it's always so special. I think for this one, the thing that felt so special is how many musicians felt honored to also be a part of this movie and to have a few musicians that played on the original. Like that, to me, felt like such an incredible moment that they were able to have this full circle moment for themselves in their career. I always work with my contractor, Peter Rodder, to make sure that the room is as diverse as possible. And so many people in that space have such a special place in their heart for the original Alice Walker book and the original movie. And so, again, for them to be a part of this, it felt really beautiful. When it was all said and done, the largest iteration, we have over 100 musicians. We had some cues that only had a handful of musicians, but there are some of those big, huge moments that get to about 100 or a little bit more than that musicians, especially when we layered in other parts of the ensemble that aren't in the traditional orchestra. So it was a lot of fun to have that much range with these amazing musicians.
Blitz, were you present for the recordings, and what are your memories of that experience?
I'd never been in a real scoring suite. My first film, I scored it myself with my band of I don't know, 5 people, maybe 6. So this was a treat, and I always love to watch artists work, and Kris and his team are just stellar. His entire team, our conductor, incredible. Fabrizio Mancinelli, I think it's how you say his last name. He was fantastic. And again, what I do remember is just, as Kris said, how honored these players were to play this music and to connect with such an important sacred piece of art, which is the color purple. And it really reminded me how expansive this property is and how important it is that we are good stewards and bastions of it. And it was very, very important for me. I also remember I enjoyed the massive scale, but I really, more than anything, enjoyed watching Kris alone on his upright piano, playing those more intimate cues. They were incredible. And I know our movie always has oscillated between the epic and the intimate. It's kind of what it's always been. And so, it was great to get a taste of all of that. And I have some great recordings, Kris, of just you in there playing. And I can't wait for this movie to come out so I can start putting that stuff out. But it was truly a treat for me. And again, to see these beautiful images we had created and watch an epic orchestra play in real time to these pictures. Because I could see, they can't turn around and see the pictures, but I can see them and the pictures. So it was truly, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, he knows I was like literally everywhere with my camera. I was like, I'm sure the musicians were like, who is this guy? Get him out of here. I was tiptoeing around in my socks, just trying to get angles and, cause again, it's never happened for me, and I also don't like to be too cool for school. I like to just, when my mind is blown, I like for my mind to be blown. And it was mind blowing watching how many brilliant musicians came in to play Kris's wonderful score.
Well, what a treat this has been to have the two of you talking about the music for The Color Purple. It's a great project. It's a great film. Thank you both for being with us today. Kris Bowers and Blitz Bazawule.
Thanks, Jon.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Many thanks to Kris and Blitz for joining us on the podcast today. And thanks to Jon for yet another fantastic interview. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Warner Brothers and Amblin Entertainment for helping put this conversation together. The Color Purple is now playing in Dolby Cinemas, where you can experience it in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. You can find a link to tickets, as always, in our show notes. If you'd like even more conversations with inspiring artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute Podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This is the Dolby Institute Podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. Thanks for joining us.